In this video there will be a lot of talk about one specific place, this place right here. This peninsula is called Anatolia, or Asia Minor as it's also referred to sometimes. And it sits just at the border between Europe and Asia, working literally as a bridge between East and West. And it's also the place where we find modern Turkey. This place has some amazing history to tell, with so many legendary people and stories that you might think it's just a fairy tale. It's been part of so many empires throughout history, and it has seen numerous wars and battles come and go. So let's join us as we're looking at the history of Turkey. In many ways, Turkey's history is that of mankind, with ruins of countless cultures scattered across the area. But it is clear that Turkey has had an important part in the development of an organized society. Human habitation in Anatolia is believed to date all the way back to the Old Stone Age, and a number of settlements has been found in the area. The most famous one, Catalhuyuk, is believed to be one of, if not the first human settlement from around 7000 BC. This settlement is without streets, and the houses are clustered back to back with the entrances being at the rooftops. But Turkey isn't just home to some of the first settlements in history, it also bears the remnants of many of the world's major civilizations, with the first major one being the Hittite Empire. It was founded by the Hittites, a people with Indo-European origin who migrated over the Caucasus region around 3000 BC. They built a feudal state that grew in power over the years, and by 1340 BC they had become one of the most dominant powers in the entire area. And at the same period of time, on the western coast of Anatolia sat the city of Troy, a place most of us know well. This was the home of the Trojans, a legendary people we've seen in movies and read about in books. Troy worked as an outpost against invasions from the Balkans for centuries, and were always coming out victorious. But as we all know, this came to an end with the Trojan War, as the Greeks finally managed to beat them with a wooden horse trick. Following the overtaking of Troy, the Greeks managed to set up cities all over the western Anatolia shore, which eventually led to the collapse of the Hittite Empire. The Phrygians, led by a legendary king Midas, whom by legend made anything he touched turn into gold, occupied parts of Anatolia during this time, as he founded the Phrygian Empire. And the Lydians established a state in the Aegean region around the same time. The Lydians produced the very first silver and gold coin in history, and they also built the Temple of Artemis, a place being on the list of the 7 wonders of the world. But both of these empires, the whole of Anatolia as well as parts of Middle East and Africa, would soon be overtaken by the Persian Empire as they just grew bigger and bigger. The central Persian ruler then divided Anatolia as well as the rest of their empire into smaller regions called satrapies, and named the ruler of the region to whom they gave their support to. But the people in these regions soon rose up against the tyranny of these selected rulers, which resulted in a series of revolts against the Persians. After having shut down the first few revolts, the Greek people came together and started one of the most known and crucial wars from ancient history, Greco-Persian Wars. With 4 major battles in Greece, one of which the movie 300 is based upon, the Greeks managed to push the Persian Empire out of Europe. With the instability in Greece, the Macedonian kingdom grew under the leadership of Philip II, and he soon ruled all of Greece. He made plans to push further east, taking all of Anatolia and what was left of Persia, but got assassinated before doing so. But he was succeeded by his son, Alexander the Great, who is widely considered to be one of history's greatest and most successful military commanders. He defeated Persia and gained control of the whole region. In fact, he created one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Greece to northwestern India. And with Alexander, Hellenism, which is the adaptation of Greek language and customs, came to Anatolia. Many years later, long after Alexander's death, Rome was expanding its territory throughout the Mediterranean, eventually defeating the Seleucid Empire, which was the largest territory once conquered by Alexander. Around the 4th century AD marks the time from when the Roman Empire started to break. The pressure and raids from foreign invaders forced the current emperor Constantine the Great to establish a new administrative center at the city of Byzantium, a place he eventually named Constantinople after himself. And by the end of the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire broke into 2 parts, with Rome as the capital to the west and Constantinople as the capital to the east. An empire that's being referred to by historians as the Byzantine Empire. And now it's time for the Turks to enter the area. The history of the Turks covers more than 4,000 years and 2 continents. They first emerged in Central Asia around 2000 BC and later spread throughout Asia and Europe, creating many independent states and territories. And then in the early 11th century, the Turks started to settle in the Anatolia region and started the foundations of what would be known as the Seljuk Empire. At the same time, the Byzantines and their empire were on a slow decline. Incompetent leaders, migrations and raids by foreign powers had set the empire on a spiral downwards, which the Seljuks saw as an opportunity. So in 1071 the famous Battle of Manzikert went down, a battle of which the Turks came out victorious. And it's believed that this was the battle that opened the door for the Turkic people to really start migrating to Anatolia over the next decades and centuries. The Seljuks took over most of Anatolia, and the period of Turkification of the land started. Out of the Seljuk Empire, the Sultanate of Rum succeeded and they ruled central Anatolia. As time went on, the Mongolian Empire grew stronger, and as we know, it turned out to be one of the biggest empires ever to exist. The Mongolians put pressure on the Seljuk Empire as well as the Sultanate of Rum, leading to the eventual crumble of them both. The breakdown of these empires turned into many small kingdoms called beyliks that were under the control of the Mongolian Empire, and these beyliks each had their own ruler. One of these rulers was called Osman, and would later be known as Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman Empire. Osman managed to establish a union of the other beyliks in the area, and in a very short period he managed to grow his small kingdom into the nearby beyliks. Osman started to look west and realized that the Byzantine Empire was very fragile. So after a series of battles and wars, he managed to expand his empire into Europe, and by the year 1400 the Ottomans were a serious power in the world, controlling the majority of Anatolia as well as much of the Balkans. However, still not in control of Constantinople. Legend has it that Osman had a dream in which a tree grew out of his chest, taking over Constantinople and then covering the entire world with its shadow. If this is true or not will remain unsaid, but we do know what happened next. In 1453, Constantinople collapsed to the Ottoman Empire under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, and thus putting an end to the Byzantine Empire. After this win, the Ottoman Empire entered an area of rapid development, expanding the empire even further, reaching its peak in the 16th century. Now, a long series of national movements started. The Ottomans, that had taken control of so many areas with different cultures and people, couldn't control it anymore, and the Serbian Revolution in 1804 marked the beginning of the decline of the empire. The Arabs, led by the Al Saud family, took back control of parts of the Middle East. In 1821, the Greeks declared war against the empire and achieved independence. In 1830, the French invaded Algeria, and in 1831, Muhammad Ali revolted and the Egyptian-Ottoman War broke out. At the start of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was at its final days, as the empire has been shredded to pieces, and many parts of Anatolia now belong to different European powers. But the loss of land sparked something inside the Turkish people, and led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the Turkish War of Independence broke out. And by September 18, 1922, the surrounding armies has been expelled. And on November 1st, the newly founded parliament abolished the Sultanate, and thus ending 623 years of Ottoman rule. On the 24th of July 1923, the Treaty of Lisan led to the international recognition of the Republic of Turkey. And later that same year, on October 29th, the Republic was officially proclaimed in the new capital of Ankara. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk became the first president of the Republic of Turkey, and he introduced a broad range of reforms virtually unparalleled in any other country. He created a new political and legal system, a new writing system using the Latin alphabet, as well as more rights for women. Almost overnight, Turkey became a modern nation-state. In World War II, Turkey stayed neutral and actually refused Germany to move troops throughout its nation to the borders of Syria and USSR. In 1951, Turkey joined NATO and became an important member, much thanks to its geographical position at the border with the USSR. In 1960, 1971 and 1980, Turkey suffered from internal military coups, disturbing the democracy in the country. But since the last one and the liberalization of the Turkish economy, the country has seen some stronger growth, especially in the population, which has really boomed over the years. If you want to know more about Turkey today, I recommend you watch our overview of Turkey, where we give you everything you need to know about this beautiful country. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss any of our new content. It helps more than you know.